So Plato's Apology. Uh, the first question I should probably answer for you is why the name? Because you'll probably notice as you start to read that Socrates, who's the guy narrating the whole thing, doesn't sound very apologetic. He sounds kind of the opposite. So this doesn't have a deep, mysterious answer. It just has a philological one. The word in Greek that we would translate probably as legal defense, they translate it as means the same thing as apology. And that became the traditional name for this dialogue, even if legal defense is probably more accurate. So that's what this is about. This is Socrates is on trial, and this is his defense. These are speeches he makes in his defense. Now, what is he on trial for? This will sound a little funny to you because we don't put people on trial for these particular crimes anymore. But in the ancient world, they seemed like reasonable things to try someone about. The first charge was atheism, or not believing in the God sanctioned by the state. And the second crime was corrupting the young, by which people didn't mean that he was a pedophile or he was molesting children, which is the first thing we think of. They meant that he was putting bad ideas into young people's heads. He was getting them to question the customs of the state and the beliefs of the state and the allegiances of the state, and they thought there was something fishy going on here, and that he was messing up the kids. Now, as I said, we have this strong tradition of freedom of speech and free liberty of conscience, and those things sound like, well, you don't send somebody to jail for that stuff, even if you disapprove of what they think, or even if you're a devout Christian and he's a cynical atheist, you don't send him to jail for that, for crying out loud, right? We don't do things that way around here, but in the ancient world, it was different. The state religion had all the power of the state behind it. They didn't separate church and state, boy. And also, it was thought that conservative ideas and traditions were what bound the city together, and that you put the city at peril if you loosened those bonds. And this also had a backdrop. It had a historical context. Not too long before, Athens had lost the war to Sparta, the Peloponnesian War. It was a catastrophe. The city got taken, all its wealth and power got stripped away. It went from being the most powerful state in Greece to being sort of a doormat, though a classy doormat. And they stayed a place where people might want to go to school. But the Athenian Empire was dead. And the loss to Sparta, they were looking for somebody to blame. And a number of Socrates' students, if that's the right word, the young men who used to follow him around and listen to him talk, had ended up playing these sort of dubious roles during the war. Alcibiades was the most famous one. He led an expedition that turned into a disaster. And these guys who followed Socrates were thought of as cynical and nihilistic and unpatriotic and sketchy. And so people were looking for someone to blame. They decided to blame the teacher. Socrates was already in his 70s by the time his trial came along. They'd been living with him all their lives, but probably the reason why they turned on him with extra violence now was because of losing the war to Sparta and looking for a scapegoat. One other thing you should know about, because Socrates refers to it in his speech, he had this thing that he called his daimon, which was like a little voice that spoke to him. And the way he described it, he could be in the middle of doing anything, and if he was about to do something wrong, something that would harm him, either physically or morally, the daimon would stop him. The little voice would tell him to stop and just sort of freeze him in his tracks. Some modern medical people wonder whether he had epilepsy or something like that, but he didn't see it that way. He saw it as a sign from the god, like a guardian angel kind of. They wouldn't use that phrase, but that's kind of how we think about it. And so that was made part of the charge, that he was believing in this god that was his own private little god that wasn't part of the official pantheon, and that was just a sign of what an atheist he was. The other thing you should know is how Athenian trials worked, because they looked very different from our trials. There wasn't a jury of 12 who needed to reach a unanimous verdict. There wasn't a prosecuting attorney and a defense attorney. There wasn't a judge. There wasn't a judge sitting up there at the front. You weren't sentenced according to the penalties laid down by precedent in the law. All of that was different. What the Athenians did, first of all, it wasn't the state that would bring the charge, it would be one of your fellow citizens. So if somebody wanted to accuse me of a crime, they could just file a lawsuit and they'd have to deposit a certain amount of money. And it was enough money that it was meant to discourage frivolous lawsuits. They deposit this money, and if I didn't get a certain number of votes from the jury, and I'll come back to that, my accuser had to forfeit the money. So that was to keep people from just doing this frivolously. The votes from the jury thing, it worked like this. It wasn't a unanimous verdict. Hundreds of people would serve on a jury. And then it was decided by majority vote. So it's more like, from our point of view, it's more like a local election than it was like a trial. And there would be two votes at these trials. The first would be guilt or innocence. Do they believe that I did what my accuser says I did? And then if they find me innocent, we're all done. And if they find me guilty, we move on to phase two, which is the sentencing stage. And the sentence is not what's laid down in a legal code. The sentence is the prosecutor proposes a penalty, and the defendant proposes a penalty, and the jury votes which of the two penalties they prefer. Okay, so if my accuser wants a death sentence and I want a $100 fine, the jury decides which of those is fairer. And even if neither is fair, they have to choose. Those are the two they have to choose between. So that was how those trials worked. When you're reading this, you'll see at certain points there's a gap on the page. There's some extra white space in between sections of the reading. That means in each of those places the jury has voted. I'll just leave it at that. There are all kinds of things I could say to you about why I think this document matters. I think it matters a lot. I think it represents a significant moment in the mind of human beings. But maybe I'll just leave all that for class. I just sort of didn't want you to be confused as you go in, and the stuff about how the trials work and all that could be confusing. Okay, we will leave it at that.